welcome. This is a response to Andre Gomez Emilsson's Open Individualism 4-part series from his YouTube channel, and links to the videos will be in the description if you want to watch them first before hearing my response and criticisms. Okay, so first off, I'd like to say that my personal philosophical approach is trying to understand what is most likely true of reality, regardless of what I'd like to be true. I think there is an objective reality independent of our beliefs. For example, that the molecules in my body are doing their complicated chemistry and physics, and our star is undergoing nuclear fusion, and that our evolutionary history led us to having behavioral tendencies independent of whether I understand these things or not. I try to have an intellectually honest approach to information, and I'm willing to modify and change my beliefs based on the evidence. So I watched the Open Individualism series with the willingness to be convinced. That said, given the arguments presented in Andre's series on open individualism, at least in this series, I do not think that there is sufficient evidence or arguments to warrant belief in open individualism. I think that the truth is always a matter of degrees of certainty, that we can't be 100% sure something is true, and that I could always be wrong, but I'm going to go through, based on what Andre said in his videos, why I don't think open individualism is an intellectually honest belief to hold. Sorry. And I'll also talk about my current understandings and a brief comment on ethics. And also, I think Qualia Research Institute is awesome, that the goals of reducing suffering and understanding consciousness are great and valuable. And I do think a lot of Andre's videos have a ton of valuable information and are very interesting and worth watching. His channel will be linked in the description. Okay, so open individualism is the claim that we are all one consciousness. He doesn't really go into exactly what that even means or how that is the case, like in terms of what the physics would be for it, but I assume that means that there's something that connects us all, like a consciousness field, and that in our normal consciousness we have the illusion that we are that we're separate consciousnesses, when in fact we are all fundamentally consciousness, like pure consciousness. In other videos he has talked about the metaphor of a balloon, that you twist a bit of the balloon out from the rest of it, so it's topologically segmented away from the rest while it's still being the balloon, even though it's twisted away. I'm not sure if I said that correctly, but I think you get the idea. Okay, so he talks about in the intro video to the series how this is an ancient belief, and that many have rediscovered it throughout history, and how smart people like Einstein or Dyson or Schopenhauer or Schrödinger have believed it. I think it's important to remember that no matter how many people believe or have believed in something, that doesn't make it true, or even make it more likely that something is true. I'm sure many people and many smart people in the past have believed things that were wrong, like that the Earth is the center of our universe, or other ungrounded beliefs. It doesn't matter who or how many people believe something. What matters is how accurately the belief actually corresponds to reality as observed, and what evidence there is for it, and if it's logically consistent. This wasn't an argument he presented for it necessarily, but it's just something I thought was worth mentioning since he brought it up. Ideas need to stand on their own merit, and smart people can sometimes hold erroneous beliefs. Next, he talks about how there are two general approaches for the belief. The experiential approach, like with meditation and psychedelics that you could get a direct insight into that we are all one consciousness, apparently, which hasn't been my experience, although I have had boundless experiences. And then the other approach is the argument one, which he prioritizes, and which I agree should be prioritized, since people can delude themselves to believing all sorts of things with certainty and actually be wrong. He claims that you can justify open individualism in a philosophically rigorous way, and he claims that it isn't just a matter of faith or belief, but that there's philosophical, logical, and scientific consistency to it. But I do not think the arguments he presented show that. He claims that open individualism has ethical implications because everyone is you, technically, under that framework, and so you should care about their suffering and not just your own. Sorry for tripping over my words. This is my first time recording something like this. Okay, so in the second video titled Definitions, he goes over 3 conceptions of the self, basically. There's closed individualism, empty individualism, and open individualism, and I'll briefly summarize them. So, closed individualism is that you continue to exist from the moment when you're born to the moment when you die. It also includes the possibility of rebirth, but the main idea is that you are a separate, soul thing, independent from everyone else, a subjectivity different from everyone, and you continue to exist from moment to moment. 1 second. Just take a sip of tea. Okay, after closed individualism, there's empty individualism, which is the idea that you're like a little time slice, that each discrete moment of experience is a different entity, and he goes into that with a little bit of detail. And then open individualism is the idea that you are everybody, that you are every moment of experience of everyone's timelines, that you aren't your hobbies or interests or like your name and job and stuff, but fundamentally you're the light of awareness, consciousness itself. Honestly, I think this is a bit of a false trichotomy of the possibilities, and I think it will become more clear when I go on later to explain what I believe. Okay, so on to the strongest arguments video of the series. In this video, he talks about how he was puzzled by the different thought experiments of what happens to you during mind melding and the teleportation or cloning thought experiments. I don't think you need open individualism to solve the puzzling things that come up when you think about these thought experiments, but I'll get into that later. So the first argument that he presents is the continuity-based argument. That required the assumption that you continue to exist from one moment to the next, so it wasn't empty individualism, and that there is something that is like your identity carrier, he called it, something that is keeping you the same subject of experience over time. And that you come to an ad absurdum for fission and fusion if you believe in closed individualism. Like, what happens to your singular soul if you split your brain and have 2 subjects of experience, or if you merge with another brain, like with a neurological bridge, he said. And now there's just one subject of experience. How with fission, the singular you can't now be in both places, and that implies open individualism, because that the A before can't equal to both B and C after, if it's one soul. Sorry, I'm doing a kind of a bad job of explaining that one. Please go watch the videos, the strongest arguments video for more in-depth information about it. The second argument he gave was the parsimony argument. Basically, the argument is that it would be absurd that the number of consciousnesses is some arbitrary finite number across all of eternity, with the assumption, I'm guessing, of closed individualism. Like, say, there's 10 to the power of 982 souls, and it's always that way, just because. But yeah, even if it was that way, like, I think reality doesn't have any obligation to be intuitive or make sense to us in a way that, like, is satisfying to our monkey brains. So it could be something whack like that, and it might not necessarily be wrong if the evidence actually led to that. But yeah, the third argument is the one electron view of the universe, that what reality truly is might be one electron, and that he said that it was proposed by Feynman during a conversation he was having with someone. I don't see how this one is evidence for open individualism. Like, even if reality is ultimately one electron bouncing around through time, interacting with itself, it doesn't prove that you are every conscious experience, unless I'm misunderstanding. But Andre even says that he isn't sure if physics nowadays supports this one electron view. But yeah. The last argument is the view from nowhere. He says, imagine you are looking at the entire universe or multiverse and see conscious beings as flashes of light, and they're all made of the same light, or maybe slightly different colors because they represent slightly different things, but they're all light. And then the question is, who are you in that universe? And the thing is, because you're taking a view from nowhere, you have no way of telling which of those flashes of light is you. And he says that information can't be created, so the information content of the universe is constant or zero, and in a way you are forced to be everybody. I find this argument a bit incoherent. I don't really know how to begin to address it, so I'm just going to, for now, go on to what I think the self is and how it doesn't imply or need open individualism. And I will come back to the view from nowhere later, I think. So, I'm personally of the belief that your subjectivity is an emergent property of the processes going on in your brain. I'm not sure what exactly the processes are, but evidence seems to point to the fact that your brain is responsible for generating your conscious experience. Like, for example, if you undergo anesthesia, whatever processes are responsible for generating your subjectivity seem to temporarily stop and you don't experience anything. You're no longer conscious. Or the time before your birth, when you lacked any subjective awareness because you weren't shaped in a way to manifest a you. What we are like metaphorically, this is something my partner came up with, was that we're like the tip of a falling deck of cards, the point where they're always touching, like a dynamic process. Like our consciousness is kind of metastable based on other processes going on, and if you knock all the cards over, the process stops and you cease being, or that point stops being a thing. Okay, so let's see how my view holds up to the thought experiments. So with the Mars teleportation thought experiment, originally presented by Derek Parfit, the philosopher, in his book Reasons and Persons, which is a good book that I'd recommend, especially that part. it's something along the lines of that you're cloned and recreated on Mars, and original you on Earth is obliterated at the exact moment that your clone is made. So from the clone's perspective, there's complete continuity of experience. I think that in this case, the original you is now, like, technically dead, and this new you, this new consciousness continues with the impression that it's still you, but in reality, it's a new subjectivity generated by the brain now over in Mars. For all intents and purposes, that cloned you can go on living as you and is basically you, but going back to the deck of cards metaphor, original you stopped when that brain was obliterated, and new you is like a new deck of cards beginning to fall at the moment it is created. You don't somehow magically jump to the Mars brain, because what you are is the result of the processes, the cascade going on in the brain that you are currently emergent from. So in the instance where, say, there's a mistake and you aren't obliterated when your clone is created on Mars, there are now two subjectivities being generated by two brains, and both feel like they are the real you, because they both have very similar genetic and neurological structures and memories. There's no paradox here that I can see. You would continue being you, the one who is not obliterated, and a new subjectivity would start where it was created, the clone one. I guess the only paradox comes up if you believed in closed individualism and thought there could only be one you, one soul for you. Then clones don't really make sense. But yeah, let's move on to another one. In the thought experiment of, say, your brain is split and say there are now two consciousnesses, there also is no paradox here from my view. Two subjects are now emergent because there is now two physical processes capable of producing consciousness. So say you were awake when they did the experiment, when your brain is sliced in two, you might wonder, well, where will I be located now? I can't be in two places at once. Will I continue on to the left side or the right side of the brain? This is actually kind of a broken question, I think. The answer would be that there are now two subjects, and one would be on one side and one would be on the other. The left one would be the left one, and the right one would be from the processes in the right one. So you, right before, are the result of the unified brain, and then the cut happens, and now there would be one sentience on the left side of the brain who probably feels like it was continuous from you, but would suddenly probably lose some cognitive processes since the brain isn't quite symmetrical on both sides. Like, one side might not have or doesn't have the ability to speak, for instance. I'm not 100% sure of all the neurology involved, but say they were the exact same, then you would just feel continuous. The left one would feel continuous and the right one would feel continuous. There would now be, the right one would feel the same. There would be now two separate conscious entities, different from the one you were before because the brain has been split. Original you is gone because original you was the consciousness that resulted from the brain being whole. So if you're just half a brain, I assume the experience would be different because, depending on, you aren't some, like, soul thing that doesn't change across time. you are a dynamic emergent property, like I said before. So if you take some psychedelic substance and you change because the processes giving rise to you, to what you call you, are now a bit different, like more energy in the system, like Andreas has said, for example, it gives rise to a conscious experience then that's different from sober consciousness because of how the structures are and the chemicals and electrical firing is happening due to the change from the substance. So just to go back to it, if the brain was split while you're awake, you might have the subjective experience that you are now, the left side, but I would argue that the right side would too, if both sides of the brain have the sufficient processes for generating a consciousness. But you can't be both, right? No, of course not. Both would arise at the time of the split, and both would feel continuity, presumably, and both would be the result of their respective brains generating the right conditions for subjectivity to arise. It's a bit counterintuitive, but it actually makes a lot of sense once you get it and think about it. No open individualism or positing of a universal fundamental consciousness field type thing is necessary to make sense of these thought experiments. Okay, so what about the brain fusion thought experiment? So if two brains were merged and now only one consciousness is generated from them, you and the other person are now just one consciousness. From what I can tell, there's no paradox here. Before the surgery, you were the subjectivity arising from the one brain, and the other person was the subjectivity arising from the other brain. And put the two brains together, or connect them, and the subjectivity now arising is a result of the two brains. So it would have different process, or a different, shoot, I'm losing my words. I'm just gonna stick to the script. Like it would be a different experience for you, obviously, if you merged your brain. Maybe you could even reverse the process and have two subjectivities again, and then that would be like the split brain case, two consciousnesses now arising again because there are two sufficient structures capable of manifesting the phenomenon. So I've heard people ask the question, why am I me? Like, why am I this subjectivity and not this other person? I'd say it's because you are you because you are a result of the processes going on in your brain, and they are them because they are the result of the processes going on in theirs. You're the emergent thing of yours, and they're theirs. If you were them, you wouldn't be you. And yeah. Back to the view from nowhere argument. The idea of a view from nowhere seems a little incoherent to me because consciousness always seems to be generated from a particular arrangement, a particular place. So even if you didn't know where you are being generated from, that doesn't mean you aren't objectively the result of some ongoing processes that are transparent to you, like one of the brains that you see out in the universe. Like subjectively, even right now, I can't qualitatively know that I'm the result of the processes going on in my brain. But that doesn't mean I'm actually not. Take electrodes to my brain and you can change my consciousness in predictable and replicable ways that point to the conclusion that my self is the result of brain processes. Or damage parts of my brain and I won't be able to speak or understand language, for example. I think you get the point. the processes that give rise to sentience are transparent to us. We don't have first-person insight into our own brain processes through introspection, which makes sense evolutionarily. You don't need to know how your own consciousness is arising in order to survive. You just need to know about the stuff in your environment that's related to your immediate survival. Okay, so my consciousness is presumably similar to other humans' consciousnesses because we have objectively similar dynamic processes going on. Our brains are similar to each other because we have evolutionary histories, similar histories, and similar genetics, and our consciousnesses are presumably also slightly different from each other because our genes aren't exactly the same, and because we've had different experiences throughout life that shaped our brains in different ways. So I don't think there's a need to posit a universal consciousness field that we are all connected to, or open individualism to make sense of our situation. An analogy my partner likes to use is that calculators aren't tapping into a calculator field that allows them to do calculations. No, it's the result of their individual arrangements that allow them to calculate. And likewise, it's the result of the arrangements and dynamic processes that are going on in your brain that likely result in the consciousness being generated in it, as it, I don't know. Smash a calculator with a hammer and it no longer generates the capacity to compute because its components are no longer arranged in ways capable of doing that task. You don't have to add an extra, oh well, it's no longer tapping into the universal calculator field because, yeah, that's just an extra added thing that doesn't seem to be needed. Just like musical instruments, they don't tap into a music field. It's just the physical processes going on that produce the fluctuating sound waves in the air. But yeah, I think that the view I have is kind of a difficult view for many people to accept, as it implies that death is final, which is can be a really depressing thing. That when your brain stops, your consciousness ceases being, and that the absence of consciousness after death is probably like the absence of consciousness that you didn't experience before birth, before your brain was arranged in a way capable of manifesting your experience, before your brain even existed. But if you want to be intellectually honest, I think you should just accept the way reality seems to be regardless of what you would like it to be. We have an evolved tendency to have a fear of death, and that leads to all sorts of things like religious beliefs and whatnot. But evolutionary tendencies aren't predeterminations of how we will or must act. Our reasoning capacities seem to be able to help us override the animal-like fear that sometimes arises when facing uncomfortable truths about reality, like the reality of meaningless suffering or the reality of the finality of death that is likely. Anyways, open individualism seems to me to be kind of another complicated form of death denial, like the desire that some aspect of yourself survives bodily death, in this case positing consciousness itself to be eternal instead of an eternal personal soul. The logic Andreas uses in a lot of his videos seems very sound, but in this one it seems like perhaps his desire for open individualism to be true and wanting to believe that it is true has limited his capacity to see the flaws in his arguments. I hope that if he sees this video, he considers the points I made and maybe reconsiders whether or not believing in open individualism is actually an intellectually honest position to hold, if his goal is to align his beliefs with what is most likely to be true about reality, independent of what we want to believe. Okay, so in the fourth part of the series, I'm not going to talk about it much. It's more like implications if open individualism is true. But he talks about how if it is true, it's a reason to help other sentient agents and try to eliminate all suffering because in that framework they are actually you. I would argue that even if open individualism is false, we still have an obligation to help other sentient beings, not because we are them, but because the reality is that suffering is awful no matter who experiences it. It doesn't have to be you to care about it. It doesn't have to be like a selfish thing to care about the well-being of other sentient agents. Suffering is a sad reality of our existence, and working to eliminate it is still a worthy pursuit. I wouldn't give that up. One last point of note, that even if all the arguments he presented were good for open individualism, arguments themselves are not evidence that something is true. I think it was Feynman that said something along the lines of that you can have a beautiful theory for something, but if the theory doesn't line up with experiments and observations, then that theory needs to be thrown out, no matter how nice it is on paper or emotionally satisfying it would be if it were true. Thanks for watching.